Welcome to our channel, where we tackle critical political, economic, and global issues. Today, we're delving into two major topics: the U.S. national debt and the Israel-Hamas conflict. We'll break down the complexities and discuss how these issues can affect your life and finances. To kick things off, we need to understand what the U.S. national debt is. In simple terms, it's the total amount of money the U.S. government owes to creditors. This debt occurs when the government spends more than it earns from taxes and other sources. As of September 2023, the U.S. national debt exceeded a whopping $33 trillion. This is a staggering number, and it's been increasing both in nominal terms and relative to the U.S. gross domestic product, with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 120%. This ratio is crucial because it shows the proportion of the debt concerning the size of the U.S. economy. So, why should you care about this massive debt? Well, it's not just a problem for economists or policymakers. It can impact your life and finances in several ways. One major concern is how the national debt affects interest rates. When the government borrows money, it competes with other borrowers like you for available funds. As the debt increases, the government might need to offer higher interest rates to attract investors, and this can lead to higher interest rates on your loans, including mortgages and car loans. Another potential impact is inflation. If the government prints more money to cover its debt, it can lead to inflation, which erodes the purchasing power of your money. A weaker dollar can mean higher prices for goods and services. We also need to think about future generations. The burden of this debt is likely to be passed on to our children and grandchildren. They may face higher taxes or reduced government services as a result. Now, let's talk about potential solutions. Reducing the national debt is a complex issue, but it can be addressed through a combination of fiscal policies, economic growth, and responsible budgeting. To kick things off, let's clarify the difference between national debt and budget deficits. The U.S. government runs a budget deficit when it spends more money than it collects in taxes and other revenues. To cover the gap, the Treasury sells Treasury bills, notes, and bonds. The national debt is the accumulation of these annual budget deficits minus any surpluses. As of September 15, 2023, the U.S. national debt stood at a mind-boggling $33 trillion. That's a lot of zeros, and this debt has been on the rise. It's essential to understand the historical context. The debt-to-GDP ratio tends to rise during recessions and their aftermath. Deep recessions, like the ones in the 1980s and 2008 to 2009, can have long-lasting effects on the national debt. Significant historical events in the U.S., like financing the American Revolution or policy decisions during President Ronald Reagan's tenure, have also impacted the debt-to-GDP ratio. Debt servicing is a critical aspect to consider. Just like individuals have finite lifespans to earn money, countries can generate revenue indefinitely. However, servicing the debt comes at a cost. The Congressional Budget Office predicts that net interest will total a staggering $10.5 trillion through 2033, with annual net interest outlays of $1.4 trillion. This can have significant implications for government spending and the economy. The United States credit rating was downgraded by Fitch Ratings due to its high and growing general government debt burden. These downgrades can have ripple effects on the economy and the cost of borrowing for the government. Now, let's discuss how this massive debt impacts you in your everyday life. Government debt is often compared to personal debt, but there are key differences. We'll explore why the borrowed money's use can matter more than the absolute debt level or its proportion to the GDP. Ever heard of the paradox of thrift? It's an economic concept that shows how individual choices to save more can lead to the opposite effect in the overall economy. We'll discuss why governments adopting fiscal austerity can often lead to deeper economic downturns, resulting in more significant deficits and debt. Government debt and servicing costs can force policymakers to make tough decisions. It's not just about the debt itself, but how it's managed and what it's used for. Public opinion plays a role in government borrowing decisions. During the COVID-19 crisis, Americans supported pandemic relief spending but opposed spending cuts for costly government programs. We'll dive into how these sentiments can influence government policies. First things first, what makes up the U.S. national debt? The debt comprises what the federal government owes to creditors, including the public and various government agencies. It's denominated in various financial instruments such as treasury bills, notes, bonds, treasury inflation-protected securities, floating rate notes, government account series, and other securities. Now, let's talk about modern monetary theory. MMT challenges the conventional wisdom that governments rely on taxes or borrowing to fund their spending. Proponents of MMT argue that governments can print as much money as they need. We'll explore the implications of this theory and why U.S. government debt levels might not reflect the saving preferences of bond buyers. Curious about which country holds the dubious title of the highest national debt? According to OECD data, Japan takes the lead with a staggering 255% debt to GDP ratio in 2022. The United States follows closely behind, ranking fourth, behind Greece and Italy. The national debt is no doubt a politically charged issue. Especially when it approaches the congressionally mandated debt ceiling, it becomes a hot topic. Politicians and financial markets grapple with the potential consequences of a U.S. debt default if the ceiling isn't raised. Geopolitical conflicts, such as those in Ukraine and the Middle East, are inherently uncertain. While talk shows and pundits may speculate, it's crucial to acknowledge that the outcome of these conflicts remains unpredictable. These uncertainties alone can have significant consequences for the global financial system. Let's take a closer look at one of these conflicts, the Israel-Hamas war. The potential for a serious escalation in this long-standing conflict is not trivial. Escalations in the Middle East have historically had ripple effects on global financial markets, affecting oil prices and investor sentiment. These geopolitical uncertainties come at a time when the global financial system is already dealing with known stresses. For example, we've seen concerns about higher inflation, excessive government spending, and questions about the dominance of the U.S. dollar. All these factors can be exacerbated by geopolitical tensions. It's essential to understand that the global financial system, despite its resilience, can be fragile. The interconnectedness of economies and financial markets means that shocks in one region can reverberate across the world. Geopolitical events can act as triggers for market volatility and economic instability. Inflation, or the rising prices of goods and services, has been a topic of concern. Slowing price increases have been influenced by easing demand, especially as consumers' pandemic savings dwindle and energy and food costs decline. While several factors suggest that inflation may stabilize at its current levels, there are reasons to believe it could increase. One significant factor is the strong employment, which is expected to support consumption. Government deficits, currently around 5% and projected to grow, will add to demand, further fueling the inflation concern. The energy transition, subsidies for strategic manufacturing, the semiconductor industry, and defense spending in a war-footing environment are all contributing to increased spending, potentially driving up prices. Input costs, which influence the prices of various products, show no signs of easing. Energy prices, in particular, remain under upward pressure due to production cuts by major oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia, aimed at meeting revenue targets. Additionally, fuel-hungry military activities have the potential to influence demand. Finally, we should not underestimate the threat of a situation similar to the 1974 oil embargo. Such an event could have a significant impact on global oil prices, with ripple effects on the broader economy. Let's begin with inflation. Food prices, affected by various factors such as geopolitical conflicts, supply disruptions, and extreme weather events, are on the rise. Commodity prices, like copper, are influenced by demand for critical minerals and armaments, leading to concerns of shortages due to inadequate investments, partly driven by ESG targets. The cost of manufactured goods may fall due to excess Chinese capacity, but the services sector in advanced economies reflects rising labor costs. Demographic changes and skills shortages are pushing wages higher, creating a wage-price feedback loop. Housing markets are strong, but affordability is at record lows. Rising insurance costs due to extreme weather risks are contributing to higher prices. On the fiscal front, government spending, affected by wars and conflicts, isn't matched by higher tax revenues, leading to larger deficits and increased borrowing. U.S. government debt, for instance, is projected to exceed historical peaks, potentially reaching 107% of GDP by 2029. Geopolitical conflict is driving de-dollarization as nations seek to reduce exposure to U.S. sanctions and asset seizures. This shift away from the U.S. dollar for trade and reserves could fragment global capital movement, impacting U.S. financing costs. The underestimated effect of higher interest rates on financial stability and asset prices is becoming more apparent. Long-term rates are now higher, and the financial sector faces headwinds, including potential write-offs and vulnerabilities in various areas, such as venture capital, leveraged finance, and structured products. President Biden and House Republicans are at odds over raising the statutory limit on the national debt. The Republicans are demanding significant spending cuts in exchange for raising the limit, while the president insists that this limit shouldn't be used as a budgetary bargaining chip. It's not just politicians in the fray. Public concern about federal spending is also on the rise. A recent Pew Research Center survey revealed that 57% of Americans consider reducing the budget deficit a top priority for the president and Congress this year, up from 45% a year ago. Interestingly, concern about the budget deficit has risen among members of both parties. However, it's worth noting that Republicans and Republican-leaning independents are more likely than Democrats and Democratic leaners to prioritize deficit reduction. To comprehend the issue fully, it's essential to understand that when the government spends more than it collects in revenue, it borrows to cover the difference. The national debt can be seen as the accumulated sum of previous year's deficits that is still outstanding. In the broader context of fiscal responsibility and government spending, this debate raises essential questions about the role of the national debt, its implications for the economy, and how it should be managed in a politically divided landscape. The Federal Reserve System, often referred to as the Fed, is currently the single largest holder of U.S. government debt. It regularly buys and sells Treasury securities as part of its monetary policy. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the Fed took extraordinary measures, massively increasing its holdings of Treasury securities to stabilize the economy during shutdowns and quarantines. At the peak of this effort in April 2022, the Fed held more than $6.25 trillion in U.S. government debt, more than double its holdings just before the pandemic began in March 2020. Although the Fed has started scaling back its holdings, it still held nearly $6.1 trillion in government bonds as of September 30, 2022. To put it in perspective, this is almost a fifth of the entire U.S. public debt. Servicing the national debt is a substantial expense for the federal government. Net interest payments on the debt are projected to reach $395.5 billion this fiscal year, accounting for 6.8% of all federal outlays. This is more than the government spending on several crucial programs, including veterans benefits, elementary and secondary education, disaster relief, agriculture, science, foreign aid, and more combined. Despite the growing debt, historically low interest rates have helped keep the cost of servicing the debt in check. In fiscal year 2021, the average interest rate on federal debt reached a record low of 1.605%. However, as the Fed raises its policy rate to cool off the economy, the U.S. has begun to pay more to borrow, with the average interest rate on federal debt ticking up to 2.07% in the past year. These are turbulent times, and it's crucial to stay informed about the national debt and international conflicts like the Israel-Hamas situation. They have real-world implications that touch us all. We'll continue to provide updates and analysis as these stories unfold. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more in-depth discussions on the important issues of our time. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.